always, of course, bring heat.
Today, Victor Riesel was released from a New York hospital. Doctors said that the sulfuric acid had permanently blinded the nationally respected crime-fighting columnist. Authorities are still hunting for the suspect who threw the acid in Riesel.
Vito didn't like no actions taken without his authorization. Otherwise, there could be a problem.
November 14th, 1897. Naples. The streets were loud, bright, and unbothered, the kind of place where names didn't matter until they did. A child was born to the De Lucia family. They named him Felice, happy. 10 days later, and 2 islands over, in a narrow Sicilian village called Lercara Fridi, another baby came into the world, Salvatore Lucania. 2 boys born into different corners of the same broken country, a week and a half apart, would grow up to rewrite the rules of organized crime in America. Felice would later be known as Paul Ricca. Salvatore would become Charlie Lucky Luciano. Ricca would rise through Chicago. Luciano would take over New York. By the time they hit their stride, there wasn't a racket, a union, or a territory in the country that didn't have to answer to one of them. Ricca built the outfit into a fortress. Luciano built the commission. They weren't partners, but they moved like men who knew the value of timing, silence, and a clean front. Ricca was the one who kept things steady. He stayed out of headlines and courtrooms when he could, and when he couldn't, he made sure nothing stuck. Even when the government moved to deport him, Italy didn't want him. So he stayed, still in Chicago, still in control. His name never disappeared from the boardroom table, even when the faces around him changed. Luciano didn't get the same kind of ending. After the war, they shipped him out. He wound up in Naples and Sicily, wandering the same streets he'd escaped. He never got back in. His empire dissolved while he watched from across an ocean. He'd built a structure no one thought could break, until it did. By 1950, Ricca was still pulling strings. Luciano was watching the next generation claw at what he left behind. Ricca had Tony Accardo in his corner, smart, tough, and quiet. Accardo knew when to speak and when not to. That was the kind of crew Ricca surrounded himself with. He didn't need a spotlight. He needed leverage. Meanwhile, Luciano, once the architect of the American underworld, had become a relic, respected, feared, but irrelevant. He died in 1962 of a heart attack at Naples airport. 10 years later, Ricca followed. By then, he had ruled longer than most bosses even lived. On July 31st, 1950, Tampa newspapers were running pieces about Paul Ricca's transformation. They called him a gentleman farmer. He owned over 1,000 acres of Illinois farmland. It was a good front. The paper mentioned his past as a coffee shop waiter, the nickname The Waiter, the connection to Capone. But they couldn't explain how a man like that ended up with that kind of land, or that kind of money. Frank Nitti had brought him in. The outfit used to eat at the place where Ricca waited tables. Nitti liked him. He brought him inside. And Ricca never left. By the time the Prohibition era gave way to the Depression, Ricca was knee-deep in unions. When the booze money dried up, they pivoted. They hit the unions hard. They drained treasuries, hijacked dues, and ran extortion plays coast to coast. In 1943, Ricca, Nitti, and Louis Campagna were indicted for looting union funds. The retail clerk's treasury alone had been stripped down to $62. Under Nitti's direction, they rolled into the stagehands union and the film industry. Willie Bioff and George Brown handled the dirty work, threatening strikes, shaking down Hollywood. They pulled in nearly $2 million from the biggest studios in the business. Ricca's cut was so big, he paid $500,000 in taxes on over $1 million in declared income between 1935 and 1941. It wasn't enough. Bioff flipped, Brown followed. Nitti killed himself before they could indict him. The rest went down. Ricca took 10 years, but he didn't do the full bid. He and the others got out after serving a third of their time. Paroled in 1947, under conditions shady enough to trigger a congressional investigation. In 1946, Ricca got rearrested. The government claimed he violated parole, associating with known mobsters, throwing lavish celebrations with no clear source of income. Ricca said it was all tradition, friends helping friends, Italian culture. The courts gave him a habeas corpus release, and the government appealed. Meanwhile, Ricca kept running the outfit and played farmer on the side. By September 9, 1950, the Senate Crime Committee, led by Senator Estes Kefauver, turned its focus on Chicago. Ricca, Campagna, and Charles Cherry-Nose Gio were summoned for a closed-door session. They'd all been part of the same extortion case. All of them had walked out of prison early. Now the committee wanted to know how. They were told to bring records dating back a decade. Ricca and Campagna showed up with briefcases. Gioe came late, carrying a package. Behind closed doors, they answered questions, while investigators connected the dots: paroles, bribes, political protection. The committee even named 2 attorneys with links to the White House, Paul Dillon of St. Louis and Maury Hughes of Dallas. No proof of bribes surfaced, just a lot of questions with no clear answers. Then came October 4th. Ricca and Campagna were locked up overnight in a Chicago jail. The cops were questioning them about the murders of William Drury and Marvin Bass. For once, their power didn't keep them out of the station house. They ate bologna and black coffee. They slept on benches. They said they didn't know anything. It was a rare thing, seeing Ricca behind bars. The same Ricca who had walked through 1,000 investigations untouched. Now, sitting in lockup like a common thug. Both he and Campagna claimed they were farmers, no longer connected to the rackets. Ricca had land in River Forest, Campagna in Berrien Springs, but nobody could explain where the money came from. They got released. No charges were filed. Chief Justice Frank Padden signed the writs. State's Attorney William Boyle didn't have enough. He asked for more time. He grilled Ricca about a Cadillac supposedly bought for Drury. Ricca denied everything. No Cadillac, no connections, no interest in gambling, no stake in the race wire business. Tony Gizzo's name came up too. He was a friend to all of them. He'd arranged rides for their wives to Leavenworth. He celebrated their early paroles. He knew where the strings were pulled and who was pulling them. The Senate committee kept working. The hearings moved to Chicago. Matt Capone, Al's brother, got pulled in next. They found him holed up in a motel near San Pedro, California, registered under a fake name. The committee wasn't just building cases. They were mapping an empire. By October 5, 1950, the noose was tightening in Chicago. The old Capone crew was feeling the heat, and this time it wasn't just from local cops or grandstanding DAs. The Senate Crime Committee, with Senator Estes Kefauver at the helm, had rolled into town with federal backing and a mission to lay bare the bones of America's underworld. 2 killings had set it off: William Drury, a former Chicago police lieutenant, and Marvin Bass, a lawyer. Both had been investigating mob ties. Both were gunned down in broad daylight. Now the committee wanted answers. Federal and state authorities moved fast. Ricca and Campagna had already spent a night in the lockup. But the rest of the crew, Tony Accardo and the Fischetti brothers, Rocco and Charles, had vanished. Word was they'd slipped across the border into Mexico, buying time and distance while the subpoenas flew. Kefauver pushed the State Department for help. Boyle wired the Mexico City police. It didn't matter. Without charges that stuck under extradition laws, there was little anyone could do. Back in California, marshals tracked down a man registered as R. Randolph Hunter at a Wilmington motel. He claimed he wasn't Matt Capone, Al's brother, but the committee served him anyway. Another brother, Ralph, had been found in Wisconsin weeks earlier. He ran a tavern. That was the thing with these guys. They never disappeared entirely. They just changed addresses. The list of names under subpoena was familiar: Ricca, Campagna, the Capone brothers, the three Fischettis, Jack Guzik. Old names. Old scars. The committee wanted to know who was still pulling strings, who was bankrolling the rackets, and who had sanctioned the recent killings. Ricca and Campagna had shown up with lawyers and gave the usual dance, polite, well-dressed, denying everything. Kefauver wasn't buying it. The next day, the hearings began behind closed doors. The witness list wasn't just gangsters. The committee pulled in everyone: Mayor Martin Kennelly, State's Attorney John Boyle, Police Commissioner John Pendergast, Cook County Democratic boss Jacob Arvey. Anyone with a badge, a title, or a file was called to the table. Virginia Hill, the woman once tethered to Bugsy Siegel, had also been served. She was holed up in Bar Harbor, Maine, pregnant and silent. Whether she'd show was anybody's guess. 3 days in, and the spotlight shifted to Governor Adlai Stevenson. He walked into the courthouse and told the committee what they already suspected. If you wanted to kill illegal gambling, you had to choke off the money, ban the transport of slot machines, cut the wires feeding race results to bookmakers, stop taxing what the states had outlawed. "I don't think Washington should tax what Illinois outlaws," Stevenson told them. When Stevenson left, Ricca entered. He'd been there before, in Washington. Now he was back, saying little, answering less. Living in a $100,000 home near Chicago and overseeing a farm worth 3 times that. He told reporters nothing. He didn't have to. The committee already had questions lined up, and some of them came with numbers. That same day, the spotlight turned to Hugo Bennett, an auditor with deep ties to racetracks in Florida and Illinois. He had loaned Ricca $80,000 over 2 years, 40 in 1943, 40 in 1950. Bennett claimed the money came partly from his own accounts, partly from 2 other figures: William Johnston, owner of the Miami Beach Kennel Club, and Max Silverberg, a man with interests in concessions at Johnston's tracks. Neither of them, Bennett said, knew what the money was for. Kefauver didn't buy it. The loans smelled bad, and the explanations were worse. Behind closed doors, Ricca played dumb. The committee wanted to know where $391,000 had gone in just 3 years. Ricca's answers, when he gave them, didn't satisfy anyone. His memory was fuzzy. His numbers were loose. They scheduled another session that night. Meanwhile, in New York, the storm was hitting hard. Brooklyn District Attorney Miles McDonald was tearing through Harry Gross's gambling empire. $20 million a year. $1 million in police payoffs alone. Gross had gone down in a grand jury raid on September 15th. Now the fallout was hitting the NYPD. 2 inspectors, John Lynn and Edward Moran, were on the run. Another, Frederick Hoffa, was suspended. Raids turned up high-end televisions, some worth over $1,000, gifts from Gross's crew to the cops who kept his books clean. The corruption was baked into every level. Gamblers greasing cops, cops protecting wire services, politicians looking the other way. Back in Chicago, the committee kept circling Ricca. They pulled in his financials. They questioned his connections. They even called in Anne Fischetti, blonde, poised, and married to Charles Fischetti, who was now hiding somewhere south of the border. She refused to talk. Kefauver warned her they'd consider contempt if she kept stonewalling. And then there was the matter of William Drury's diary. Word around the committee was that Drury had been keeping notes, names, payments, threats. The day he was killed, those pages became gold. Drury had been working on Harry Russell, a known gambler with ties in both Chicago and Miami. Drury had told Russell to flip. Russell told him, "Turn and you'll end up like Benaggio." Drury did. The committee suspected it was no coincidence. Even Jack Dragner, the so-called Al Capone of California, had been roped in. Before he took the stand, the Los Angeles police handed the Senate a transcript of a conversation between Dragna and Alan Smiley, the man who was sitting next to Bugsy Siegel the night he died. Dragna had allegedly said, "I'm going to Chicago to get back that $500 a week from the sports news, or somebody's going to get hurt." The sports news, just another name for the race wire service. When they asked Dragna, he denied everything, straight-faced, deadpan. Ricca wasn't much better. Behind closed doors, he admitted he bought a farm truck from Charles Barran, the guy who serviced the mob's cars. That much he'd say. The rest, like always, was lost somewhere in the fog of forgetfulness. By mid-October 1950, the net was wide, but the fish were still slippery. The Kefauver Committee's spotlight was no longer just on Chicago. It had panned out to take in the whole syndicate. Drew Pearson's syndicated column laid it out plain. Frank Costello, the so-called Prime Minister of the Underworld, could have been deported years ago for lying on his naturalization papers. But Costello wasn't some low-level goon. He had money, influence, and friends in the right campaigns, especially in New York's Democratic machine. While a former OSS asset like Rudolf Sally faced deportation to certain death in Soviet-dominated Finland over a 2-decades-old bootlegging charge, Costello lounged peacefully in the penthouse, untouched. Pearson's roll call of the Mafia read like a rogues gallery of American power in the shadows. In Chicago, Tony Accardo, Capone's successor, kept a low profile, calling himself a betting commissioner, but everyone knew he ran the outfit. Charles and Rocco Fischetti, Capone's cousins, had been among the financiers behind Bugsy Siegel's Flamingo Hotel. Louis Campagna, Phil D'Andrea, and Charles Gaioe, all veterans of the 1943 movie industry extortion case, were still active, operating under the radar. Paul Ricca, now a multi-millionaire with property in Illinois and Michigan, remained the consigliere in all but name, backing gambling houses and moving money through the system like an accountant with a criminal resume. The committee was looking at more than names. They were tracing connections. Rocco de Grazia, a known Capone man, had links to Kansas City killings. Anthony Tough Tony Capezio ran his corner of Chicago like a fiefdom, with whispers of narcotics and unsolved murders hanging over him like smoke. Even Ralph Capone, Bottles, still held sway from his Mercer, Wisconsin hideaway. Beyond Chicago, the tentacles reached everywhere. Ray Patriarca had a grip on New England from his Providence headquarters. Angelo Melli had taken the reins in Detroit after Pete Licavoli stepped back to a Tucson ranch, but Melli still held real muscle: coal, construction, liquor, politics. Jack Dragna ran the West Coast rackets from behind the facade of a shirt shop in Los Angeles. His name surfaced again and again, in race wires, extortion, even a murder transcript. His paycheck, courtesy of Chicago's Illinois Sports News, came in clean at $500 a week, until it didn't. By October 19th, the stench was drifting south. The Miami Daily News published a blistering editorial aimed squarely at Florida's Governor Fuller Warren. The paper didn't mince words. Florida's dog tracks stank of Chicago mob money, and it was time to clean house. It laid the blame on public apathy, on politicians pretending not to smell it. The Miami Beach Kennel Club was the nerve center. William H. Johnston, a campaign backer of Governor Warren and the head of both Sportsman's Park in Illinois and the Miami Beach track, was in deep. His clubs were crawling with ex-Capone figures. The names were familiar. Johnny Patton, a Capone guy, had once run the tracks with a tight grip. Robert McCullough, another outfit man, was now under suspicion for the recent murder of William Drury, the Chicago ex-detective who had blown the whistle on dog track corruption. Leslie Shumway, David Kind, others with long rap sheets and connections to the Chicago syndicate, were found embedded in Florida's racing industry like ticks. And then there was Hugo Bennett. Bennett, an auditor for Johnston's tracks, had admitted in front of the committee to loaning Paul Ricca $80,000, 40 in 1943, another 40 in 1950. 20,000 of that came directly from Johnston. Nobody believed it was just a loan. The tracks weren't just entertainment, they were laundromats for syndicate cash. The editorial made it plain. Florida had a chance to act. The state had done it before. Back in 1941, Governor Spessard Holland had cleaned out Tropical Park. But under Warren, the current racing commission had gone silent. The editorial ended with one blunt question. "It's your commission, Governor. What are you going to do about it?" By November 29th, Johnston was back in Chicago, trying to put out fires. He landed at Midway and checked into the Blackstone Hotel, where reporters were waiting. He denied knowing Patton, said he wouldn't recognize him if he walked through the door, called the whole story utterly ridiculous. He admitted knowing Crosby, the governor's gambling investigator, but kept insisting he had no ties to the Chicago crew. Meanwhile, Bennett was under pressure to walk away from the National Jockey Club. The Illinois Racing Board had already declared his loan to Ricca not in the public interest. Asked if he would resign, Bennett said, "It looks like I may have to." His excuse for knowing Ricca. His father had been friends with Ricca's wife's father, back in Italy. It was always Italy. It was always family. That was the shield, and sometimes the sword. By 1951, the web of power and protection surrounding Chicago's top gangsters was no longer invisible. It was just ignored. On April 15th, the Des Moines Register peeled back the layers on Charles Cherry Nose. Gio, a veteran enforcer of the Chicago outfit, whose reputation stretched across state lines. Gio, once just another streetwise thug in Capone's stable, had built a second career muscling into gambling rackets, running liquor during Prohibition, and quietly planting himself in Midwest cities like Des Moines. But Des Moines wasn't Chicago. Gio first showed up there in the 1930s, operating under aliases like Charles Veltri and Charlie Joy. He pushed into the gambling racket hard enough that Detective Chief Jack Brophy gave his cops a standing order: jail him on sight. If he resisted, shoot him. In 1936, Gio packed up and left town. When he tried to return in 1942, this time with financial stakes in a local nightclub, he got chased out again. This time it was friends doing the pushing. The club in question, the Mainliner, had already drawn heat. Gio was tied to its operations through Pete and Gladys Rand, but the trouble came when Lou Farrell, also known as Louis Fratto, showed up with a revolver, demanding cash. Farrell later denied the whole thing, claimed he didn't know Gio, even though they grew up blocks apart in the same Chicago tenements. The Rands weren't buying it. They took out a court injunction to keep Farrell out of the club. When the Kefauver committee came knocking, Farrell denied ever seeing Gio in Des Moines. Gio, in contrast, gave up the details with casual ease. He told the committee he'd run liquor into Iowa from Wisconsin for 7 years, partnered briefly with local promoter Pinky George, and even dabbled in wrestling and printing gambling sheets. He painted himself as a hustler who moved in and out of Iowa when the money was right, and out again when the heat came down. Pinky George called the story fiction, claimed he'd never worked with Gio, never touched wrestling in Des Moines during that stretch, and that any real records would back him up. Gio shrugged it off. The past was blurry, and no one in this world had clean receipts. The real story was that Gio was never far from the center of things. He had grown up with Tony Accardo. He ran with the Fischetti brothers. He was in on the movie Extortion racket that put several of Capone's old hands behind bars. When he testified before the Kefauver committee, he played it careful. Just enough detail to sound honest, just vague enough to keep himself out of deeper trouble. Old case files in Des Moines showed Gio and Henry Guardino were persons of interest in a 1937 bombing of the Fifth Avenue cigar store, a local gambling house. Police suspected Gio had tried to cut off the shop's race wire feed from Kansas City before the bomb went off. Brophy's take? Gio was trying to turn Des Moines into a young Chicago because he didn't feel safe back home. By 1943, Gio's name was on a federal indictment alongside the outfit's top brass, Ricca, Nitti, Campagna, D'Andrea, Rosselli. The charge: extorting over $1 million from the IATSE union through a crooked assessment fund. Nitti killed himself when the indictments came down. The rest did time. Gio went in on February 6, 1944. He started at Atlanta, but didn't stay long. Complaints and connections got him moved to Leavenworth. He was out on parole by August 1947. A year later, he was picked up for a violation, eventually released again on a court order, but his parole would hang over him until 1954. Bioff and Brown, the two IATSE insiders who had rolled over, were out of Sandstone Federal Prison by 1944. Bioff had testified that Gio was part of the meeting at Chicago's Bismarck Hotel where the shakedown was orchestrated. Present that day: Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, Campagna, and a quiet attorney named Sidney Korshak. Our man, according to Gio. When he speaks for us. Gio brushed off questions about his parole. Said he earned it the right way. Good conduct, backing from the judge, a letter from the Attorney General. But that was only part of the record. In truth, he had a history of arrests that stretched back decades. In 1930, he was picked up with machine gun Jack McGurn after the Fox Lake massacre. The following year, he was arrested with a cardo on weapons charges. By 1937, he was putting serious money, $12,000, into Chicago's Seneca Hotel, brushing shoulders with guys like Alexander Louis Greenberg, tied to Canadian Ace beer. And when he wasn't in prison or courtrooms, Gio was diversifying. He went into construction, partnering with Frank B. Pantaleo, a former Marine combat engineer. It was another clean front in a dirty world. Meanwhile, down in Florida, the fallout from the Kefauver hearings was shaking loose even more rot. Hugo Bennett, the man who had loaned Ricca $80,000, was being dragged through the courts. On December 4, 1951, the Miami Herald reported that the Florida State Racing Commission was teaming with Attorney General Richard Irvin to remove Bennett as a stockholder in the Miami Beach Kennel Club. The evidence was damning. Bennett had funneled the money through real estate deals and quiet loans, with cash tied to William Mr. Big Johnston and Max Silverberg. The money moved. No one could explain why, and Bennett wasn't the only one. John Patton, the so-called boy mayor of Burnham, Illinois, was another club stockholder. Under pressure, he moved shares around, hiding ownership through family. The commission called it a shell game. Then came Annette Caravetta, widow of Frank Nitti. Her name floated as the next target. This wasn't about dog racing anymore. It was about territory, about real money. The commission had done it once before, under Governor Holland, cleaned out Tropical Park, forced the syndicate to sell. Now they were trying to do it again, one name at a time. And behind it all, the same ghosts lingered. Ricca, Campagna, the Fischettis. Invisible hands steering the game. Even after prison, even under parole, the Chicago bosses kept their grip. By the autumn of 1952, Washington's war on the underworld took on a new tactic: denaturalization. Behind closed doors in Chicago, federal agents were quietly preparing paperwork that would claw back the American citizenship of foreign-born gangsters. Technicalities, loopholes, anything to get them out. The target list read like a Mafia who's who. Paul, the waiter. Ricca, born Felice de Lucia in Italy, was at the top. He had stepped into the shoes of Al Capone and never looked back. Ricca had become the quiet strategist, the man who spoke softly but commanded from the shadows. He was naturalized in 1928, but the Justice Department now wanted to argue that he'd lied about his occupation, about his background. It didn't matter how long ago it had been. If they could prove fraud, he could be stripped of his status and thrown out of the country. In Washington, the message was clear. Those who can be caught will be deported as soon as possible. Across the nation, similar actions were underway. Frank Costello, the gambling kingpin of New York, was accused of fabricating information on his 1925 citizenship application. In Miami, Alphonse Big Al Polizzi and Harry Rosen were also under scrutiny, accused of falsifying their naturalization forms. And then there was the body. In Chicago, Charles Cherry Nose Gio was found slumped in his car, 2 bullets in his skull, the job done clean. 52 years old, a parolee since 1947, Gio had walked away from a 10-year sentence tied to the same extortion racket that took down Ricca and Louis Little New York Campagna. The 3 had done time for extorting over $1 million from Hollywood. Nitti, the architect of the scheme, had eaten a bullet when the heat came. The others had taken their chances in court. Gio's parole had sparked outrage. He got out early. They all did. Ricca, Campagna, DeAndrea, Roselli, Kaufman. But it was Gio who paid the price in the end. Shot in the head on Chicago's near north side, just another ghost in a long line of ghosts. Federal investigators shrugged. Another gangland hit. Another message. But Ricca wasn't going to go quietly. When federal agents subpoenaed him for questioning in a deportation probe, he showed up in a grey suit, red and white tie, and a smug smile. Inside a federal office at 433 Van Buren Street, he faced off with immigration investigator Robert J. Devlin. The questions were straightforward: birthplace, entry date, occupation, how he became a citizen. Ricca answered just 2. Name, Paul DeLucia. Address, 812 Lathrop Street, River Forest. Then he clamped down behind the Fifth Amendment like a vault door. 15 questions, 15 refusals. His attorney, William Scott Stewart, dared the government to make its case without his help. If they want to deport him, they'll have to do it the hard way, he told the press. Ricca, smirking for the cameras, knew the drill. He'd been through worse. But behind the grin was a tension no pinstripe could hide. The government wasn't just playing court games. They were coming for blood. In the meantime, Ricca had found new ground to stand on: white sand, palm trees, and the insulated wealth of Miami Beach. On April 27th, he registered with the Miami Beach Police Department using his real name. Not Ricca, DeLucia. Then, on May 11th, he bought a $75,000 mansion at 4385 Pine Tree Drive from none other than Tony Salerno. The house placed him in the middle of an underworld retirement community. Just down the street, Trigger Mike Coppola, Joe Massey of the Purple Gang, Sam DiCarlo, the Angasola brothers, and a small-time Florida bookie named Peanuts, Tronaloni. It wasn't exile. It was succession planning. Miami Police Chief Romeo J. Shepard made it clear Ricca had signed all the paperwork, registered as a known criminal, and hadn't broken any local laws. As long as he plays by the rules, the chief said, there's nothing we can do. But everyone knew better. Ricca was no relic. In March 1950, Captain William J. Drury had called him the Midwest boss of the Mafia. Drury, a former Chicago cop, had written a brutal exposé for the Miami Daily News. He named names. He traced money. In October 1950, Ricca and Campagna were hauled in for questioning after Drury was gunned down in his driveway. Shotgun ambush. Close range. No witnesses. Later that year, Senator Wiley grilled Ricca before the Kefauver Committee. Asked about a suspicious $120,000 payment to settle $500,000 in back taxes, Ricca played dumb. couldn't remember who paid it, couldn't remember who signed the checks. Then came the $80,000 loan from the Miami Beach Kennel Club, money funneled to Ricca through William Johnston, a local dog track kingpin. The club's finances were suddenly under a magnifying glass. Dan Sullivan from the Miami Crime Commission blasted the transaction as a bribe disguised as a business deal. Ricca just smiled. This was America, a land of opportunity, for those who knew how to seize it, and for men like Paul Ricca, a place where the rules were merely suggestions. He had played his cards from Capone's right hand to the top of the national syndicate, and now, in a palatial house on Pine Tree Drive, he waited. The government was still knocking, but Ricca had learned a long time ago. They knock for years before the door comes off its hinges. They brought him in through the freight elevator at 433 Van Buren Street, like he was just another civil servant showing up for work. But Paul, the waiter, Ricca, wasn't here to punch a clock. He was here because the government was trying to strip him of the one thing he had fought to keep for 3 decades, his U.S. citizenship. At 56 years old, Ricca, the last man standing from Capone's inner circle, sat quietly in a federal immigration office, dressed like a man who knew how to play the part. Tailored grey suit, white shirt, red and white patterned tie, grey felt hat. He looked calm. He even smiled for the cameras. But the stakes were life-changing. 15 questions were laid in front of him. Not one answer. Not about his name. Not about how he entered the country. Not about the 2 killings he was tied to in Italy before the age of 20. All Ricca gave them was what was already public record. His name, Paul de Lucia, and his address in River Forest. The rest he left in silence, shielded by the Fifth Amendment and flanked by his lawyer, William Scott Stewart, who had seen this play out before. Federal investigators, led by Robert J. Devlin under orders from Attorney General Brownell, were gunning for him. The goal was simple: prove that Ricca lied on his naturalization forms, said he was a restaurant manager, omitted the murder convictions in Naples, and revoke his citizenship. Deportation would be next. Stewart made it clear: if the government wants to make a case out of Ricca, they'll have to do it without his help. But Ricca's silence only escalated things. Deputy Immigration Chief Joseph Cushman signaled the next move: refer the transcript to U.S. Attorney Robert Teakin, who would likely push for contempt charges. This wasn't just legal pressure, it was strategic. Ricca's fall would send shockwaves through an underworld that had grown comfortable in boardrooms and union halls. The same day, in another column, Labour columnist Victor Riesel was writing about a different message from the underworld. This one written in dynamite. Willie Bioff, the former Capone bagman turned federal witness, had been living quietly under the name William Nelson. But his past caught up with him in the most brutal way. Somebody had planted explosives under his car in Phoenix. When it went off, it sent a message louder than anything he could have said in court. Bioff's murder wasn't just revenge, it was a warning. The men running the syndicate now didn't wear brass knuckles. They wore manicures. They didn't fire Tommy guns. They moved money, millions at a time, through pension funds, welfare pools, real estate deals, and front companies that sold everything from machinery to labor peace. The Combine, an unholy alliance between the remnants of the Capone gang in Chicago and the Purple gang in Detroit, was more powerful than anything in the Prohibition era. It ran like a corporation, not a crew. Cherry nose. Charlie Hio, another stool pigeon who had once worked alongside Bioff, had been rubbed out long ago. Now it was Bioff's turn. Not because he posed a direct threat. The Combine could have shut him down with a phone call. No, this was symbolic. A message to anyone in labor who thought they could talk and walk away. even those who hadn't been touched, like George Brownie Brown, the former president of the AFL Stagehands Union, who'd also testified against the Chicago Six, were left alone. Brownie had been a pawn. Bioff had been the architect. And in this new era of mob power, there were rules. As Ricca dealt with contempt charges and denaturalization hearings, the federal government opened another front. On October 10, 1956, U.S. Attorney Robert Tieken filed a lawsuit in federal court to revoke Ricca's citizenship entirely. They accused him of entering the country under a false identity, hiding his record in Italy, and posing as someone else when he applied for naturalization in 1928. In Italy, he'd been known as Felice de Lucia, convicted of voluntary homicide in Naples in 1917 and tied to another murder in 1920. According to Assistant U.S. Attorney John Bickley, Ricca had served time for one killing and fled prosecution for the other. And Italy didn't want him back. As the press in Milan and Rome caught wind of Ricca's legal troubles, newspapers like Il Giorno, Paese Sera, and Il Secolo d'Italia mocked the idea of his return. They didn't see Ricca as a prodigal son. They saw him as an American-made gangster, dripping in diamonds, stepping off a boat with a flashy tie and a smirk. Paese Sera called him Malavita Americana, the living symbol of what happens when crime goes corporate. The only man happy to see him, one paper joked, might be Lucky Luciano. By June of the following year, Judge Walter Labui delivered the blow Ricca had feared. He ruled that Ricca's naturalization was fraudulent, that he had concealed his real identity and criminal history, and ordered the revocation of his citizenship. Ricca, ever the tactician, prepared to appeal. But the government wasn't done. They wanted the passport. They wanted the certificate. And above all, they wanted him out of the country. Behind the scenes, Tieken wasn't just focused on Ricca. He was building something bigger, something systemic. He ran the U.S. Attorney's Office like a white-shoe law firm, bringing in corporate strategy to map out the criminal landscape. Every few days, his team updated an organization chart of crime figures, tracing connections from Chicago to Las Vegas to New York. When someone like Ricca fell, they didn't just celebrate a win, they tracked who moved up, who filled the vacuum. It was a new war. The mob wasn't running numbers out of candy stores anymore. They were laundering millions through gambling, narcotics, and the growing muscle of the unions. Tieken's team broke the operations down by region, racket, and function: gambling, theft, politics, legal services. They weren't just busting gangsters. They were reverse engineering the syndicate like a hostile corporate takeover. And the connections kept coming. On August 21st, 1957, the Senate Rackets Committee dropped another bomb. Two of Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters locals had spent $150,000 on a country estate once owned by Paul Ricca. Hoffa denied knowing Ricca, denied knowing De Lucia, denied knowing anything, even after a check surfaced with the name Paul de Lucia endorsed on it. Hoffa insisted the estate was for training union officers, not laundering mob cash. But the committee wasn't buying it. Robert F. Kennedy, serving as committee counsel, described Ricca as a notorious hoodlum and connected him to the Capone legacy Hoffa claimed to have no part in. The deeper they looked, the more threads they found. Phony locals in New York, loans to Hoffa from his own union without collateral, alliances with known labor racketeers like Johnny Dio and Anthony Tony Ducks Corallo. Hoffa wasn't just rising, he was consolidating. And Ricca, he was still fighting deportation. On the morning of August 22nd, 1957, the Senate Rackets Committee turned the heat up on Jimmy Hoffa. In a packed hearing room, they dropped the needle on a wiretap. Hoffa's voice, unmistakable, speaking with Johnny Dio, one of New York's most notorious labor racketeers. The exchange was casual, familiar, two men talking shop. But on Capitol Hill, it played like an indictment. Hoffa had already taken the oath. He'd told the committee he hadn't tried to pull Dio's cab drivers into the Teamsters. He'd said President Dave Beck had killed that idea early. But then came the tape, and Senator John F. Kennedy, calm but cutting, made it clear. This was only the first of a curious series. There were more tapes, and those tapes would show Hoffa wasn't just brushing up against organized crime. He was in it. The conversation dated back to February 1953. Dio in New York, Hoffa in Detroit. They were talking about Local 102, a unit the AFL had wiped out. Dio said they still had garages signed up, still had muscle. Hoffa didn't push back. He talked about calling Dave Beck, about getting something started in New York State. "We'll sit down in Washington," he said, "evening of the 4th. Dio agreed. It was business as usual. Now under oath and under fire, Hoffa didn't flinch. He said he knew Dio, sure, had met him at the 1952 AFL convention in New York, introduced by Anthony Doria, the same Doria who had just invoked the 5th. But Hoffa insisted he wasn't trying to bring Dio into the Teamsters. He was just keeping the situation stable. Keeping things on an even keel, as he put it. Committee counsel Robert F. Kennedy wasn't buying it. He accused Hoffa of using Dio to charter 7 fake locals in New York, unions with no members, no meetings, no legitimacy. Just names on paper designed to seize control of the East Coast transport scene. Kennedy pushed, and Hoffa parried. Perspiring but composed, he said there was no contradiction between what he'd told the committee and what the tape revealed. He insisted the plan was never to bring Dio in, just to manage the fallout from a messy situation. The hearing was barely underway when another layer unraveled, this one involving money, hotels, and familiar names. Committee accountant Carmine Bellino laid it out. During Hoffa's recent bribery conspiracy trial in Washington, the Teamsters had picked up a tab at the Woodner Hotel. The bill totaled nearly $9,000. Of that, over $5,000 had gone to cover boxer Joe Louis and a cast of Teamster business agents, lawyers, and hangers-on. It wasn't just about the rooms. There was Robert Baker, a known organizer and racketeer, whose own bill ran more than $1,600. Then there was O. Byram Hearst, connected to Judge Benita Shelton Matthews, who had presided over Hoffa's trial. His bill? Still unpaid. A private detective's expenses were on the ledger too. Even John Cowling, a Detroit political figure and leader in the National Negro Tavern Owners Association, got a check, $260, just days before his ad praising Hoffa appeared in the Washington Afro-American during the trial. Hoffa denied discussing the ad with Cowling, said he couldn't recall if they'd even spoken. But the money had moved. The committee hauled in Cowling for a closed-door session. No announcement followed, but the implications were clear. Hoffa was using union money to build a defense that reached far beyond the courtroom. That afternoon, Hoffa returned to the stand and handed over a list of stock holdings. Most of it wasn't made public, but under questioning he admitted to owning shares in A.C. Wrigley and McLean Industries, both with contracts tied to the Teamsters. He shrugged off any concern. The amounts were small, he said, not enough to matter, but the scrutiny didn't end there. The committee drilled into a $75,000 loan made by 2 Hoffa-controlled locals to the Abstract and Title Guarantee Company of Detroit. The company turned around and loaned that money to the Marbury Construction Company. Hoffa said it was a smart deal. 6% return. He preferred doing business with friends. That's how he operated. Then came another familiar name, Paul the waiter, Ricca. The committee had checks showing that Hoffa's locals had spent $150,000 on Ricca's Long Beach estate on Lake Michigan. Hoffa claimed he'd never heard of Ricca, said they bought the place from someone named Paul de Lucia. Kennedy pointed to the check, made out to de Lucia, Ricca's alias. Hoffa denied knowing the two were the same man. The estate, Hoffa said, was to be used as a training school. Union business agents would learn how to manage welfare and pension funds. That was the party line. There were more questions. A $40,000 loan from Local 337 to Northville Downs, a harness racing track. Did it have anything to do with the fact that local President Brennan raced horses there? Hoffa said no. It was a short-term loan, repaid in 90 days. Just business. He was also asked about trusteeships. Hoffa admitted he personally controlled 17 locals. Across his central conference of Teamsters, there were 33 under direct supervision. In those locals alone, Hoffa held sway over more than 31,000 members. That gave him 44 votes at the upcoming Teamsters convention in Miami, votes he could use to crown himself president. Harold Gibbons, his right-hand man in St. Louis, had another 6,000 members in trusteed locals and 10 more votes. Hoffa didn't just want to run the union. He wanted to own it from the inside out. The next day, August 23rd, the headlines shifted tone, but the theatre continued. Hoffa was painted as the innocent, a boy in a man's game, the crown prince of the Teamsters, who somehow kept bumping into gangsters and couldn't tell who was who. Take Sam Feldman, a Philadelphia organizer with a rap sheet that included shoplifting, armed robbery, burglary, narcotics, and 4 years in Sing Sing. Hoffa backed him to charter a new restaurant workers' local, even though there was already one in place. When questioned about Feldman's record, Hoffa played it wide-eyed. "What record?" he asked. Robert Kennedy laid it out. Hoffa blinked, claimed he only knew Feldman had some difficulties. The senators weren't laughing. Feldman had enemies. One lunchroom operator opposed his organizing. That owner wound up with a broken neck. Hoffa said he didn't know anything about it. Then came the mansion outside Detroit. $915,000 from a local union, spent to buy an estate that could house 30 guests. Once again, the seller, Paul DeLucia. Once again, Hoffa claimed he didn't know that DeLucia was Ricca. Once again, Kennedy brought the receipts. Hoffa stuck to the script. Said the estate was for educational purposes. Said the sellers were just names on a contract. Said he saw the good in people. The committee saw something else. And they weren't finished. By the late 1950s, it was no longer about Tommy guns and getaway cars. The Chicago outfit had grown up. What had once been a street-level operation built on bootlegging and murder was now something more evolved, something corporate. And at the center of this quiet evolution sat Paul the waiter Ricca, a man who had never fired a shot in public, but who ran things like a chairman of the board. On November 27, 1957, the man tasked with dismantling that boardroom empire was Robert Teakin, a sharp federal prosecutor with a background not in criminal law, but corporate litigation. He didn't come at the mob with batons and wiretaps. He came with organizational charts, financial audits, and legal strategy. His pitch was simple. If the outfit was acting like a corporation, then treat it like one. Track its hierarchy, document its functions, and disrupt it at the executive level. Teakin's team maintained a sprawling, ever-changing map of Chicago's underworld, a chart as intricate as anything you'd find in a corporate boardroom. It detailed the outfit's reach, slot machines and jukeboxes in Cicero, Melrose Park, and Forest Park, handbooks and dice games in Berwyn and Stickney, pinball routes and vending territories across the Loop, the North Side and the West. Numbers rackets ran through the South Side, and narcotics. That was a New York-Chicago bridge, driven by their uneasy partnership with East Coast interests. The killing of Albert Anastasia in a New York barbershop had been a message, but the weapon traced back to a Chicago warehouse. That was something else entirely. The same with Frank Scalise's hit in the Bronx. The lines of communication and power ran both ways, and Ticon's chart showed it in real time. But no line carried more weight than the one drawn straight to Ricca. He wasn't just the face of the outfit. He was the structure. Under different names and behind layers of front men, Ricca quietly controlled labor rackets, gambling spreads, and business investments from Chicago to Las Vegas. His influence extended to Peoria, St. Louis, even the desert beyond Nevada. He had what Ticon called service functions. Outfit members acting as political fixers, accountants, lawyers, men who operated more like CFOs and lobbyists than gangsters. Ticon thought the public might care if they understood that this wasn't just about hoodlums roughing up storekeepers. It was about financial empires built on extortion and fraud, embedded in real estate and pension funds. But most people didn't see it, because the outfit didn't need headlines. They needed contracts. That changed in May 1958 when Ricca went back to court. Not for racketeering, but for tax evasion. He was 60 years old now, standing trial again in a federal courtroom in Chicago. The charge, failure to report over $128,000 in income between 1948 and 1950. The case turned on what came to be known as the Attic Alibi. Ricca's defense claimed that he had stashed $300,000 in cash in the attic of his River Forest home before going to prison in 1943. Upon his parole in 1947, he simply retrieved it. That money, his lawyers argued, funded his spending in the years under scrutiny. The government wasn't buying it. Assistant U.S. Attorney William Barnett zeroed in on Ricca's lifestyle: new Cadillacs, insurance policies, real estate purchases. 4 cars in 1947 alone, 2 Oldsmobiles and 2 Cadillacs paid for in cash. All this after Ricca reported losses on his tax returns. It didn't add up. The prosecution's strategy was straightforward. Ricca hadn't earned enough in the 1930s or 1940s to explain the attic money. If he didn't have it before prison, he couldn't have spent it after. Clayton Marsh, a former revenue agent, testified that Ricca's own lawyer had once insisted his client didn't profit from the Hollywood extortion ring that led to his 1943 conviction. That testimony became another crack in the attic story. The defense, led by William Scott Stewart, pushed back. Stewart questioned every figure, dissected every chart, and put pressure on the credibility of the government's witnesses. He pointed to a conversation from 1946 where Ricca's lawyer allegedly denied profits from the movie industry shakedown. That, Stewart argued, supported Ricca's position. He hadn't been making money, so he must have had that attic reserve. By May 14th, the courtroom agreed to a truce of sorts. No one would use the word hoodlum. Ricca, now on trial under his real name, Paul DeLucia, watched calmly as the jury listened to testimony about how he'd financed a life of quiet affluence after prison. Revenue agents traced how he bought property and insurance, dropped thousands on cars, and filed returns showing losses. Prosecutors called it a shell game. The defense called it smart savings. One witness, Frederick Armstrong Jr., said that in 1943, Ricca's cash reserves totaled just over $2,000, far from the attic treasure. Armstrong also testified that the syndicate had paid Ricca's legal bills during the 1943 trial, a claim that brought the outfit back into the room, even if no one was allowed to say the word. By May 20th, the government shifted tactics. Instead of hammering Ricca as a gangster, they painted him as a humble taxpayer, at least in the 1920s and 30s. They used his own filings to build a timeline, one that showed a man who claimed modest income year after year. Paul Mahon, a senior IRS investigator, lit up charts in the courtroom showing Ricca's financial story from 1934 to 1948. It began in the red, never hinted at a hidden fortune. Mahon testified that Ricca declared just over $8,000 in 1934. Stewart pushed back hard. He suggested the government was assuming Ricca's honesty only when it fit their narrative. If Ricca had been lying all along, underreporting income before 1943, then maybe the Attic Alibi wasn't so far-fetched. Mahon said he had no choice but to assume Ricca paid what he owed. Stewart fired back, "You assumed that if he had income, he reported it." Mahon stood his ground. "That is the only inference I can make." Then came the argument over Hollywood. Ricca had done time for the movie industry extortion case, a scheme that netted the outfit hundreds of thousands from the studios. The prosecution claimed Ricca's share alone totaled over $400,000. Stewart said that number was inflated. They went back and forth over the math, the assumptions, the tax law. The year 1934 became a sticking point. Ricca had reported low income, yet somehow helped finance a $180,000 exhibit at the Century of Progress exposition. Stewart suggested it wasn't a coincidence. The numbers didn't lie. Somebody was. And the trial kept going. On the morning of November 27, 1957, a federal courtroom in Chicago felt less like a place of justice and more like the boardroom of a sprawling multinational corporation. District Attorney Robert Tiken wasn't chasing lone gunmen or stick-up artists. He was targeting a modern syndicate with a command structure tighter than any business on LaSalle Street. To him, organized crime wasn't a gang anymore. It was a corporate entity. With daily revised flowcharts taped across his office wall, Tiken mapped out the criminal economy as if he were dissecting Standard Oil. The faces weren't executives. They were bookmakers, enforcers, fencemen, and shadow investors. But the structure, it was pure business. And at the center of it all was Chicago. Tiken had traded corporate litigation for mob hunting. He treated the outfit like a hostile takeover. Every time a hit went down in New York, the ripples were tracked in Chicago. The gun that took out Albert Anastasia was traced back to a storage unit in the Windy City. And when Frank Scalise got it in the Bronx, Tiken's chart lit up again, with lines redrawn between Bronx real estate and Cicero moneymen. It was the same every time. The bodies dropped in one city. The planning happened in another. Chicago didn't just pull triggers, it pulled strings. What Tiken saw wasn't a criminal conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was a network of investment portfolios, political lobbying, labor infiltration, and a brutal efficiency. The outfit had divisions: gambling, narcotics, labor, vice, extortion, each with its own managers, each with service departments handling legal, financial, and political maneuvering. They didn't just buy judges, they funded careers. They didn't just shake down businesses, they opened them. And under Paul, the waiter Ricca, the Chicago wing didn't just follow the money, they created it. By the late 1950s, Ricca had become a ghost with an iron grip. No title, no meetings, no paper trail. But every move in Cicero, Melrose Park, Berwyn Township, every number racket, slot operation, and cigarette vending route ran with his blessing. His name didn't show up on licenses, but his influence showed up in profit margins. New York dominated narcotics and labor racketeering. Chicago locked down gambling from the Loop to Las Vegas, right through downstate Peoria and into St. Louis. To Tiken, it wasn't even personal, it was structural. You don't prosecute a mob, he'd say, you dismantle a business model. And Ricca's operation had mastered vertical integration, control the action, launder the proceeds, and bury the leadership under layers of fake names, front men, and phantom real estate holdings. But for all the sophistication, Ricca still had to answer to the oldest problem in American organized crime: taxes. On May 13, 1958, he stood before a federal jury, not for racketeering or extortion, but for income tax evasion. The government wasn't accusing him of murder or conspiracy. They were accusing him of lying about where the money came from. Specifically, $300,000 he claimed had been sitting in his attic, untouched, since before his 1943 conviction in the Hollywood labor extortion case. Ricca's story was that simple. He stashed it before doing time, dug it out after his 1947 parole. That's what financed his Cadillacs, insurance policies, and real estate buys in River Forest. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney William A. Barnett, wasn't buying it. They called it the Attic Alibi, and they intended to destroy it. Barnett went in for the kill with charts, receipts, and ledgers. They weren't trying to convict Ricca of gangsterism. They were trying to show he couldn't math his way out of a paper bag. If he only made $8,000 in 1934, and he went to prison broke in 1943, where the hell did 300 grand come from in 1948? That's what they wanted the jury to ask. Defense attorney William Scott Stewart tried to punch holes in the government's numbers. He grilled IRS agents. He poked at inconsistencies in dates and estimates. One key witness, a former revenue official named Clayton Marsh, testified about earlier conversations where another of Ricca's attorneys had denied Ricca made any money off the movie industry shakedown that sent him up. The implication? Ricca couldn't hide money he never had. But it was the tone of the trial that showed how far things had changed. Both sides agreed not to use the word hoodlum in court. That kind of language belonged to another era. In 1958, men like Ricca weren't shot callers with Tommy guns. They were CEOs with burner phones and cash-heavy portfolios. The jury might have been hearing about crime, but what they were really being asked to do was audit a balance sheet. By May 14th, Barnett was digging deeper. He had revenue men detailing how Ricca bought 2 Oldsmobiles and 2 Cadillacs the year he got out of prison. He lined up paper trails on insurance premiums, property deals, and even the exact models of the cars. One witness testified that Ricca had just $2,200 to his name in 1943, hardly enough to bankroll a suburban empire 4 years later. Another disclosed how Ricca's legal fees in the 1943 trial had been covered by the syndicate. The prosecution wasn't arguing Ricca had gotten rich illegally. They were arguing he never declared the income. Ricca's people weren't disputing that he lived large. They were just saying he'd pulled the money out of insulation and spider webs. By May 20th, the case hit a strange turn. The government now painted Ricca as a humble taxpayer during Prohibition, while the defense practically admitted he'd lied about his filings. It was a bizarre flip, but it was strategic. The feds needed to show a financial vacuum. The defense needed to build the illusion of a paper trail. Barnett rolled out the forensic accountants, armed with charts that filled courtroom walls. They worked under harsh lighting, laying out Ricca's life like a quarterly earnings call. The picture they painted started with a negative balance in 1934 and ended with a supposed $48,000 in 1948. But no attic stash. Paul Mahon, a top revenue investigator, testified about Ricca's alleged income from the Capone years through the late 1940s. When pushed, Mahon admitted he'd relied on algebraic formulas and reasonable inference to fill in the gaps. Stewart pounced. "Are you assuming he paid taxes honestly on every cent he made?" he asked. Mahon replied, "That is the only inference I can make." Stewart sneered. "Let's see if you did." Mahon's math clashed with Stewart's timeline. The government had traced over $200,000 to Ricca's share of the Hollywood extortion racket, a shakedown that sent multiple outfit figures to prison. The defense claimed the number was closer to 400,000, and if Ricca really had that kind of scratch, why wouldn't he hide it? The real question, though, wasn't how much Ricca made. It was when. Because the tax years in question were 1948 to 1950. And if the money didn't exist before he went in, and it wasn't earned after he got out, then it didn't come from the attic. It came from the street. There was also a deeper layer in play. Ricca was fighting for more than his money. He was fighting to keep the outfit insulated. His conviction wouldn't just mean fines. it would mean exposure. It would mean prosecutors getting one step closer to the corporate model Tiecken was trying to crack. And Ricca's silence, the same silence he'd held since Capone's day, was the only thing holding the network together. By the fall of 1958, Paul the waiter Ricca, once Al Capone's right-hand man, and now the shadowy don behind the Chicago outfit's modern rackets, was facing the slow-motion unraveling of his American empire. On October 14th, the Supreme Court quietly sealed the fate of Ricca's long-fought battle to retain the thin legal veil that protected him, his United States citizenship. The court refused to hear his final appeal, leaving intact the ruling that his citizenship had been fraudulently obtained under a stolen name. The Justice Department had argued that Ricca was never who he claimed to be. Born Felice de Lucia, he had fled Italy in 1920 after a 2.5-year prison stint for a 1915 murder, and after allegedly committing another killing that same year. By the time he arrived in the United States, Ricca had slipped into the underworld using another Italian immigrant's identity, burying his past beneath layers of silence and corruption. But silence has a way of wearing thin. Judge Walter J. Labouie, presiding over Ricca's case in federal court, was blunt. The citizenship had been obtained through deceit, and the appellate court agreed, although it did spare Ricca a $500 contempt fine for refusing to answer questions during a deposition. While the government celebrated the ruling, Ricca wasn't packing for Italy just yet. He was tangled in a second legal war, a conviction for income tax evasion. That June, Judge Julius H. Minor had sentenced him to 9 years in prison and slapped on a $15,000 fine for dodging nearly $100,000 in taxes across 3 years, 1948, 1949, and 1950. Ricca, perched comfortably in his palatial estate on Bonnie Brae, in River Forest, remained free on a $10,000 bond, while his attorneys pushed his tax appeal through the courts. In December, the federal government took its next step. Acting Immigration and Naturalization Director Monte Mutal personally served Ricca, now legally a non-citizen, with a notice to show cause why he shouldn't be deported. The hearing was set for January 6th. Ricca, once untouchable, was now formally registered as an alien. The government's case was straightforward. Ricca had no right to be in the country. He had entered with false papers, concealed a murder conviction, and built a criminal dynasty under the cover of a false identity. The charade was over, at least legally. But Ricca's fate, like so many mobsters before him, would be delayed by the machinery of American justice. Then came a twist on New Year's Day, 1959. The United States Court of Appeals, in a carefully worded opinion, reversed 2 of the 3 convictions in Ricca's tax case. The justices were unimpressed with the government's evidence from a pair of 1954 meetings where Ricca's lawyers had sparred with Internal Revenue agents. The court concluded that the prosecution had failed to prove Ricca himself made any false statements in 1948 or 1949. However, the 1950 count stuck. That alone was enough to keep Ricca in jeopardy. His original 9-year sentence was expected to be trimmed down to 3 years, and the fine reduced from $15,000 to $5,000. His legal defense had leaned heavily on the story of a $300,000 attic cache of hidden cash, which his attorney Joseph Bulger allegedly counted and used to explain away Ricca's unreported income. The appellate court didn't buy most of the story, but they acknowledged the government had overreached. They also noted how absurd it was to expect a layman like Ricca to navigate a hostile legal interrogation with full understanding. It was, as the court phrased it, verbal fencing. For now, Paul, the waiter. Ricca remained in his home, surrounded by lawyers and bodyguards, watching the law chip away at his legacy one ruling at a time. He was no longer just a mob boss dodging the heat. He was a man without a country, a godfather in exile awaiting the final verdict on whether his empire would end in a federal prison, or aboard a boat back to Naples. On March 7, 1959, the Justice Department's quiet war against the American underworld broke through the surface. For the first time in years, key syndicate figures were being dragged into courtrooms and forced to face what had once seemed impossible: real legal consequences. At the heart of this crackdown was Attorney General William P. Rogers' program, a calculated, coordinated assault on the structure of organized crime. This wasn't a splashy front-page operation. It was systemic. Grand juries were impaneled across the country. Intelligence was pooled from the FBI, the Immigration Service, and Treasury agents. The message was clear: no more shadows to hide in. Names like Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Paul the Waiter Ricca were no longer whispered in fear, but read aloud in federal indictments. Genovese and Costello faced narcotics and tax charges. Ricca, already convicted, was running out of places to hide. The feds were using every tool available: tax codes, immigration law, antitrust statutes. What brought down Al Capone now aimed to sweep away the generation he spawned. Milton Wessel's task force began mapping the country the way the mob had done years earlier. Field offices were opened in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Miami. Each branch traced the men who had attended the infamous Appalachian Meeting of 1957. 60 delegates had come together in that quiet New York town to consolidate power and map territory. Now, their names were marked. Genovese stood trial. Russell Bufalino, another Appalachian delegate, was fighting deportation. Joe Profaci had been stripped of his citizenship. Frank Costello, already serving time for tax evasion, saw his naturalization revoked. Then came Paul Ricca. The man who had stood beside Capone was sentenced to 3 years in prison and fined $5,000 for dodging over $35,000 in taxes on more than $71,000 in income. The same man who had once run Chicago's syndicate from behind the curtain now faced deportation to Italy. His 1928 naturalization was under fire. Federal authorities claimed he had lied to gain citizenship. And while Ricca's lawyers worked every legal angle, his old world was unraveling. Fred Evans, the financial backroom man, a syndicate player from the Nitti era, was found dead, ambushed on the west side of Chicago. The police found $17 in his pocket. Robbery wasn't the motive. The shot caller had been silenced. The Evans killing wasn't an isolated act. It was a symptom of the housecleaning underway. The men who knew too much or held too many secrets were being cut loose. By October 1961, Ricca walked out of Terre Haute Federal Penitentiary, his sentence served. There were no headlines, no photographs, no welcome. His son picked him up. The man who had once helped run an empire was now a federal target on supervised release. A few months later, a federal appeals court upheld the deportation order. Ricca appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. They refused to hear the case. It was final. He was to be removed. But Italy wouldn't take him. By April 1962, Ricca had 6 months to find a country that would. There was no rush at the airport. No one lined up to claim him. He was a gangster without a nation. Felice de Lucia, born in Naples, sentenced in absentia for a murder in Italy before fleeing to the United States, had become Paul the Waiter Ricca. He had served in the trenches of the Chicago mob, survived Nitti's suicide, outlasted Capone's prison sentence, and helped orchestrate an extortion racket that shook Hollywood for millions. Now, he stood alone. His criminal resume followed him like a shadow. Italy called him a liability. Monaco would take him as a tourist. 47 nations said no. The number would grow. By December 1962, it was 50. By 1964, still no one wanted him. He kept reporting to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, a punctual visitor in a quiet lobby, climbing into elevators like any other retiree. Every month he confirmed what the feds already knew. He had nowhere else to go. By then, his nickname carried more irony than menace. The waiter had gone from taking orders in a Chicago diner to issuing them across the city's underworld. He had played his hand during the rise of Scarface, helped Nitti run labor rackets, and kept his head down when the government came after the mob. But now, stripped of his US citizenship, rejected by Italy, he was a footnote the government couldn't erase. Secretary of State Dean Rusk seemed more focused on deporting political agitators like Michael Strulans than career criminals like Ricca. Strulans had entered the US as a publicist for Katanga. Ricca had come in under an alias after murdering 2 men in Italy. One man got the full weight of the State Department. The other got ignored. By February 1964, Ricca was on his 17th visit to the Van Buren Street office of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Still unemployed, still unwanted, still technically deportable. But with nowhere to go, Ricca stayed. And the government, for all its authority, watched as a gangster without a nation clocked in month after month, waiting for a door to open that never would.